Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 5 of Reading Genesis with Jesus. Here with Dr. Andrew Steinman again, and we're going to look into some passages from Genesis, and we're going to ask the same 3 questions again that we have been asking. This passage really highlights the whole Isaac and Rebekah story. And my question to you, first off, is about the Messiah. Where do you see Messiah in these passages?
Well, I think we have to focus on Isaac and Rebekah and their marriage and their having children, right? And it's easy, again, to read over this because it's not emphasized as much in the Isaac and Rebekah story as it is in the Abraham and Sarah story. But Rebekah, like Sarah, has trouble bearing children. She has trouble getting pregnant. And we're told at one point Isaac prays on behalf of his wife, and then God hears his prayer and she becomes pregnant, of course, with twins, yes. Right? God goes over the top again, gives her 2, right? Not just 1. But, you know, the whole story of Abraham sending a servant out to find a wife for his son. Abraham's very concerned about this promise, always has been. He was concerned, how am I going to have this promise without a child? Now he's got a child, and he's concerned at the end of his life, this child has to have a wife so that, God can keep the promise. So it's not so much in the words of God giving a promise in this one, as that I think it is in just following the line down and how through events God fulfills this promise. He gets a wife for Isaac through Abraham's servant. He gives him 2 sons. And then he gives us this unexpected thing that, right, the older will serve the younger, right, telling us right away where the promise is going. It's not going to the older son like you would expect if you were living in ancient culture back then. Older son gets the promise, right? Younger son is going to get the promise. And so we see it there. And then we see it in Jacob, despite the fact that he, does some questionable things here at the instance of his mother, right? His mother puts him up to it. He steals the great blessing. But nevertheless, God is with him. And God is going to bless Jacob, even though Jacob has done some shady things. And it's interesting that Isaac seems to accept this, right? He sends, eventually will be sending Jacob away and saying, go up to Paddan Aram and, go to your relatives and find a wife there, right? He says all this to him, knowing that, this is God's will. Isaac kind of was fighting against God's will. I want to give it to Esau, right? I want to give a great blessing to Esau. But then he figures out, maybe I got to go with what God has in mind, not what I have in mind. And so we get all of this wrapped in, and the circumstances saying God is working through all these circumstances. And even when people go off the rails, they can't derail God's plan. And I think that's where we see the messianic promise here.
Sure. We can make all sorts of messes, can't we? And we're good at it.
Yeah.
We're quite good at it. And I think that's one of the things that we relate to in Genesis, is that this isn't the story of everybody doing it right. It's the story of God and his promise working despite and sometimes through those missteps that we make. All right. So then let's get under the surface and give us a little insight of what do you see in these stories, Isaac and Rebekah, or whatever you kind of find most interesting here that we wouldn't see.
Yeah, something that you probably won't see, and it has to do with how things are translated, unfortunately.
Okay.
We have Abraham and then later Isaac dealing with people that in most English Bibles are called the Hittites.
Okay.
Now, that can be quite confusing. In the ancient world, there was a land of Hatti in kind of central Turkey.
Okay.
We discovered these people, archaeology brought them to light about 100 years ago. And they called them the Hittites from their land of Hatti, right? And yet we meet Hittites here. They're not up in Turkey. What's going on here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the problem here is that there's a people in the land of Canaan, the sons of Heth, who are called Hittites. And the Hittites we meet here that Isaac is dealing with and Abraham was dealing with earlier are not the guys from Turkey, kind of, out of their area. They're actually a Canaanite tribe. And I think it's important for us to see this because the same word is used to describe later on when we get to the book of Samuel, Uriah, the Hittite. But he's not some mercenary who hired on from Turkey. And the Hittite Empire is long gone by then. He is actually a Canaanite. And so we have these people in the land of Canaan, probably ancestors of Uriah later on, right? They deal fairly faithfully with Abraham. When Abraham buys land from them, he has to negotiate with them and so forth, but they sell the land. They respect Abraham's rights to own it. They're Canaanites, but yet on a human level, they deal faithfully and they deal trustworthily with Abraham and pretty much with Isaac too. And interestingly enough, when we get to Uriah, one of the descendants, right, he is in some ways more righteous than David in that story. Here we have a Canaanite who is obviously converted to worship of God, right? He's worshiping the God of Israel, and he's almost more faithful to God during that story than David is, where David's looking for a way to get Uriah's wife, and then he was looking for a way to get rid of Uriah because Uriah has become a problem because of what David did. And Uriah is the one who is faithful to God, even though he's a Canaanite. So I think what we see here in Genesis is, even though these people perhaps weren't believers in God, it doesn't mean that in everyday affairs they can't deal honestly and faithfully. And we deal with people all the time who aren't Christians that can still be honest with us, and we can deal with them on a level of doing business with them and interacting with them as neighbors or whatever it is. And I think we see that in these Hittites too. But they're really the sons of Heth, one of the sons of Canaan, and they're a Canaanite tribe that the people are interacting with. And so the Canaanites get a bad name, and rightfully so for some of their pagan practices. But it doesn't mean everything they did was, that they were just always dishonest and they were thieves and, murderers and everything else, even though some of their religious practices were, as God calls them, abominations. And so I think knowing who these people were and that Abraham and then later Isaac is interacting with them gives us some insight into, we have, as Luther would talk about, two kingdoms, right? We have the kingdoms of this world that we exist in, and we have the kingdom of God that we exist in. And when we're in the kingdoms of this world, we deal with people who are not Christians, who are not children of God by faith. That doesn't make everything they do something to be suspicious of, right? It means that we can deal with people of this world.
Yeah, it really is easy when you're reading through, particularly Genesis, but I mean certainly other parts of the Old Testament as well. Whenever you hear the word Canaanite, you want to kind of lump them all together. We get this long list of all of these different, different peoples who were a part of that, and it's easy to kind of read right over the top of it without realizing that they're all going to have their different cultures, and some of these people, like you said, could be dealing very honestly and faithfully. And so I think that's a really, really helpful reminder for us. Well, you've already given us one thing that really feels very much like a message for us, but I'm looking for one more. So what kind of message do you see from this section of Genesis that we just got to hear today?
Well, I think from this death of Sarah to the death of Abraham, it's often with Abraham's life overlooked, right? I mean, before this we get to the sacrifice of Isaac, and then it seems like very quickly we get some stuff from the end of Abraham's life. Mm-hmm. But I think we shouldn't kind of skip over it so lightly, because it does have a message for us. Abraham was so focused on having this child with Sarah that God promised that it's almost as if he overlooked some of the other blessings that God might give him. And I think sometimes we get to be like that. There's something that we would really like God to bless us with. And, that's on the uppermost of our mind. And then we forget God's blessing us in other ways. That Abraham here gets another blessing. He has another wife, he has more children, and other nations come from this. And God had told Abraham, I'm going to make you a father of a family of nations. Mm-hmm. But that kind of gets lost in the shuffle with the desire for this son from Sarah. And God fulfills that promise too. And I think sometimes we look for a certain blessing. There's something we really desire God to do for us. Mm-hmm. And that's not wrong. But sometimes we get so caught up in that we forget God blesses us in many other ways. And we just don't see it because we're focused on everything else.
We do. We get so myopic. It's as if we're laser focused on one thing. And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a beautiful thing. Maybe it's a God blessed kind of thing. But we end up being so tunnel vision on it. You're right that we'll miss all the rest of it. And I think it just speaks to the breadth of blessing that God gives. He doesn't just give us one little singular blessing. It's all over the place.
Yeah. Jesus talks about God giving you a blessing that's patted down and flowing over.
That's right.
Right? And we sometimes don't even see the overflow because we're so busy looking at, something that we really desire God to do for us or for our family or for our job or whatever.
Yeah. All right, small groups. I think it's overflow time. So I have a feeling you're going to be talking about that overflow of blessings that God, and you know what? God has it right there. You're all together. You're spending this time talking about God's words, sharing with one another. There is an overflow of blessing that you're experiencing right now. So let's let it overflow. See you next week.